Welcome to Reconciliation Roundtable. I'm your host, Mark Beckwith, retired Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark in New Jersey. I blog regularly on markbeckwith.net and have this podcast where I gather various religious leaders to talk about their spiritual journey, what has enhanced their perspective on their faith and what has gotten in the way, and where do they see hope and where do they see concern. And today I'm hosting Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz, who has been my friend and colleague for many years. Matthew is the senior rabbi of Temple B'nai Jeshurun in Short Hills, New Jersey, which is the largest Reformed congregation in the state of New Jersey, is the author of To Build a Brave Space, The Making of a Spiritual First Responder, published in 2022, and The Gift of Grief, Finding Peace, Transformation, and Renewal of Life After Great Sorrow. Matt is regular commentator on MSNBC Morning Joe, CNN on State of the Union. He is president of the Coalition of the Religious Leaders of New Jersey, where we first met some 15, maybe now 20 years ago, and he took over that duty after I retired. He and Imam Dean Sharif and I have been on Morning Joe together several times. We've been together on a PBS show hosted by John Meacham. We took an interfaith group of Christian Jews and Muslims to Israel, Palestine several years ago. And with Imam Dean Sharif, we hosted a TV show for years called A Matter of Faith on New Jersey Public Television. What an honor to have you, Matthew, and to have you drawn in from Israel, where you are sitting as we speak in Jerusalem. Our friendship and collaboration have been enormous gifts in my life, and it's an honor to have you. So welcome.
Thank you, Mark. I love being with you, and particularly love being with you from here.
Matthew, you have been a rabbi for a long time. What was the process of your being called to be a rabbi? What else were you considering? What prompted it, and what got in the way?
Well, the story goes in my family lore that when I was 5 years old, I got up and announced in front of the family that one day I'm going to be a rabbi on a motorcycle. So that was the initial story. I don't remember saying it, but I remember everyone telling me that. And I went off to have a pretty typical American suburban and then city life. Went to college. I'd been to Israel for a year between, but I didn't see it more than just going to do what now people call a gap year. And I was in the corporate world, and my mother said, I want to spend some time with you on Yom Kippur afternoon, the Day of Atonement, the most holy day for Jews. I was very happy to be able to miss some synagogue time to go see her. And I did. And she said, son, you are happy, but you're not fulfilled. And I said, Mom, who's fulfilled at 23 years old? Of course, I'm not there yet. And she said, I know, but I believe that children know more about themselves than adults give them credit for. And that's why I always ask kids what they want to be at young ages, and I'd have them follow that if I can. And she said, when you were a little boy, this is what you said. And I think, son, this is what's going to give you fulfillment in life. And I thought she was frankly out of her mind. And I gave her 10 reasons that I could never be a rabbi. And she answered all of them and then gave me 10 more reasons why she thought I'd be uniquely qualified to be a rabbi. And it took me another 3 years, mostly because I'm the soul brush that got in the way. I didn't want to see it. So I knew it spiritually, but intellectually, it really took me a while. In fact, it was not until I took my first serious theology class in my third year that I convinced myself intellectually that I should be a rabbi. Emotionally, spiritually, I always knew. But intellectually, it took me years.
And what have been some of the challenges once you became a rabbi in your role as the rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun and earlier when you were an associate rabbi in New York City?
You know, I would say that, and I'm guessing this is not just rabbis, I'm guessing that lots of my Christian and Muslim and Hindu brothers and sisters feel the same way. Probably took me a couple of years to get over the imposter syndrome. And that was honestly the first challenge. You know, who was I to get on a pulpit and share wisdom? You know, who was I to comfort someone at their time of leaving the world? Who was I to sanctify the marriage of a couple? After all, I wasn't married myself and didn't have children. It really took me a while to own what I can say with humble confidence. I really want to emphasize humble confidence that God wanted me to do and be. And it was really hard to be able to see that I had that kind of ability to reach people in their most sacred moments. So before you get to any of the political struggles we all follow or the economic ones that we have to deal with in terms of running our respective parishes, I think you got to really understand who you are spiritually. And by the way, as a tangent, I would say, I never thought it was great for kids to go right from college to seminary, because when you then come out 4 or 5 years later and you've never ridden a commuter train, you never know what it's like to struggle with bills. And all you are is, why aren't you praying enough? Why aren't you committed enough? And the person just got off the commuter train. They're just trying to sort of figure their lives out and pay their mortgages and feed their children and get SAT tutoring done. So I think that there is life experience that's needed. And those first few years of one's clerical appointment, I think really give you that experience to know, by the way, when not to share what you're not experienced at. A great piece of advice I got from a congregant years ago: that don't try to be 50 when you're 28, be 28. And whatever wisdom you have at 28 is actually going to be wisdom that we're going to be really gratified to receive. But if you make believe you're someone else, you're not going to. So lesson 2 was, I used to tutor the publisher of the Village Voice in Hebrew. So every Thursday afternoon, I play racquetball with 3 classmates, and then I go tutor him. And I think in retrospect, even though he paid me, I probably learned more from sitting at his feet than he did from me. And one of the things he said to me was, my first job was the associate editor of the op-ed page at the Times. And he said, if you try to get up and give me a sermon that's an op-ed, you're never going to succeed, because I can outright you any day of the week. He said, but if you get up and try to tell me what the tradition says about how it is that we see current events, then you're going to teach me something that no one else can teach me. So I was always taught to be grounded in text and tradition, and to know that the people out there don't want pediatric religion. They actually want something that's relevant, intellectually curious, and spiritually curious.
What I'm hearing is that you felt called to be yourself in the context of the deep and robust religious tradition that you claim. And it made me think of my own journey. I remember just before my first ordination to the diaconate, I almost didn't go because my fear was, once ordained, I would be expected to be reverent and proper. Neither of those two things I wanted to do or thought that I could do. And I discovered, no, people wanted me to be me and to reflect on the tradition from my own perspective. And that's what I'm hearing from you. In the course of your rabbinate, you have been very involved. Certainly, our relationship is a demonstration of that, with interfaith work. And again, the three of us, yourself, me, and Imam D. Sharif, we've had a long and vital relationship with one another. Why is that important? Why is the interfaith component of your ministry, your rabbinate, why is that so important to you?
Very much like the story I told about my mother suggesting to me that I became a rabbi, it was really organic. The way it worked in my associateship in New York is I was given a portfolio of responsibilities, none of which included interfaith work. My senior rabbi wanted that for his own. He did it really well. So I actually was not involved in that way until I came to New Jersey, which was a long time, 9 years into my rabbinate. I wasn't anti-interfaith, I just wasn't involved. And I was told by my emeritus, asked/told to come in to meet a group of leaders who once represented the Interfaith Coalition of religious leaders of the state. I want you to give the invocation. And I did. And I sat down next to a brand new bishop from Newark. And he said to me, what are you interested in? And I said, I really miss New York City. I had just gotten there. And I was a born and bred Manhattan kid. And this person said to me, well, you should come to the new city you live near. It's called Newark. And I've connected recently with an imam named Dean Sharif, and we are working on gang violence. You want to come on Tuesday to a meeting. Obviously, that was you. You remember well that the reason that you first brought this group together was because 4 college students were killed assassination style in a park in Newark. It got a lot of national headlines. And you said, let's take an ecumenical approach to this. And I showed up the next Tuesday. I remember as vividly as I'm looking at you now, coming into the workroom of the diocese. And it felt as natural to sit down with you and Dean and the others that joined us as anything had in my life. So it didn't even feel like it was something I had to work at. We put a lot of work in, all of us, and there was a lot of struggle. And there continues to be more struggle now than perhaps there was then. But very quickly did we realize two things. One was that for sure, we were all equal in our connection to the ultimate parent, which of course is God. And there was nothing different between the three of us and the rest of our brothers and sisters. But in our mortal capsules, there's a lot of things that are different. And I remember that we stuck up for difference being the bridge to connection. And I think that the opposite is often the case with interfaith work, which is that we try to find everything that's similar instead of highlighting what's different. And different does not have to mean oppositional. It just means that we can contain in one, well, we can hold in one container many different truths. And I think we not only felt connected to that, but believed that and then modeled it for other people. And I think that's the difference between our interfaith work and I think other philosophies around that.
I remember a train ride that the three of us took to be recorded for PBS, hosted by the historian John Meacham. And we started talking about our respective religious traditions. And somebody nearby said, "This has been the most fascinating conversation I've ever heard." And I remember for me, and this has often been the case, my desire to be involved in interfaith work is by stepping beyond my tradition. I learn more about my own and it deepens my faith. So my faith has been enhanced by my relationship with you, with Dean Sharif, and we've honored each other in such important ways. So really appreciate that. Matthew, in your book, you come up with the Hebrew term machloket, which is disagreeing without rancor and disagreeing with respect. In my sense of the Jewish tradition, that's gone on for thousands of years. Can you say more about that and how important that is to you and how we, the world, needs to engage more in machloket?
One of the great things about the Hebrew language is that it's all based in its 3 or 4 letter roots and tells you a lot about the philosophy of the word, not just the word by way of it being something to use to communicate. It says something existential and not just physical. And the word Israel itself, you break it down to its root, means one who struggles with the concept of God. And that means intrinsic. So it goes back to Jacob, whose name, of course, is given the name Israel, and his struggle with the unnamed man or angel. Big debate about that. But what it comes down to mean is that you can only be a successful spiritual being if you're willing to struggle with what is ultimately existential. And that tradition grows into this thing called machloket. You said it perfectly, but you would add to it for the sake of heaven. So they distinguished the rabbis of old between arguing for the sake of heaven and arguing for the sake of itself, which ends up being hatred. And if you're arguing for the sake of heaven, you are disagreeing so that you can grow, you can evolve, you could stand in the truth of someone else's shoes, if you will. And you can not only stand in their shoes, but you can teach their truth authentically with a desire to understand who they are and where they come from. So that's how I grew up. My father used to say around the dinner table, God forbid should we agree, but we should always do so respectfully. And that's supposed to be, this doesn't mean it's acted out by Jews all the time, but that is supposed to be the Jewish tradition that we argue for the sake of growth. By the way, the Passover Seder, the most celebrated meal by Jews every spring, starts with 4 questions, not with answers, with questions. The Talmud, the great body of Jewish law, second major body, starts with a question. And a theology professor used to say to me, the reason we're so anti-idolatry is not because of God's jealousy. God can handle God's jealousy. That's a human emotion, not a divine one. But idols are concrete and they're finite. And once you learn everything about them, you know everything about them and you stop growing. But God is so the opposite of that, that by not understanding, you're constantly growing until you yourself, your life ends and you become part of the energy of God. So it's probably longer than you wanted, but that's where that comes from.
No, that's great. And this notion of machloket, disagreeing without rancor for the sake of heaven, and you're sitting in Jerusalem as we're speaking, how can you apply, or how does one apply machloket to the current crisis and the war between Gaza and Israel?
Well, as you and I both know, if we somehow could separate those of us who I'd call 70% of the exhausted majority, where if we stopped being so tired and got ourselves more energized to spend time with each other, the fringes on both sides, let's call it 15% on each side, would not have any place to go. And we would get a lot done and a lot talked about. And the same thing goes for here. Those who are extreme here are really extreme. What I have seen by way of how the extremists even educate their children, both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, are they're being raised to hate each other. And so it is so tangled up. But everyone else here actually, because the Middle East is a place where, when I first got here years and years ago, it wasn't everyone so pushy, but they're pushy, they're not mean. And they're
Mhm.
straightforward. They say anything they want to say to you, but not because they don't care about you. I was once in a taxi about 3 years ago. I had members of my congregation with me, and the taxi driver and I got into a big argument, first about how much he was charging me, because I could tell he was trying to rip me off because he thought I was a tourist who didn't understand the language. And two, we had an argument about the election that was the next day. And the congregants, I looked back, I could see they got scared. By the end of the conversation, the taxi driver and I were talking about each other's kids and about raising kids and about loving our wives. And they said, how is that possible? And I said, because the argument ultimately was to make our points known to each other, but not to assassinate the other's character. And that's how I actually find it easier here to have conversations with people who don't agree with me, because they actually are interested in the conversation and interested in what I have to say. I find in America, too often the retort is already in someone's mind as they're listening to what you're saying, meaning they're not listening to you. They're just waiting to prove their point and let you know why you're not correct. So that doesn't solve the Middle East crisis, but I do find it easier to communicate here.
Hearing the root of the word Israel, one who struggles with God, there is this long-standing history, tradition of struggling with one another around difference. And you can be energized, you can be hot-headed, but it's part of what people have been doing for thousands of years.
And it's not mean spirited. I'm not saying they're not mean spirited people, but the intent is
Yeah.
not mean spirited. I mean, people will quickly take you in to give you melon and tea and coffee and tell you that you're wrong about everything, but while loving you at the same time.
In your book, you talked about the journey that you and your congregation had in New York City. You were an associate rabbi toward the issue of gay marriage, and you really wrestled with that. And can you describe a little bit about that, and how can we learn from what you learned from that struggle many years ago?
There are two parts to the story. One is that, the 90s, which do not feel like a long time ago, are 30 years ago. Hard to admit. And we were an Upper West Side liberal congregation, liberal religiously, but most, I think we voted Jerry Nadler probably 90-10. The word George Bush was anathema to be said on the streets of the Upper West Side. Very different environment than now, but that's where it was. And we had hired the second openly gay rabbi in the country. That's where we were. Everyone else had been in the closet. And my senior rabbi made a really bold move. And at the table of decision of who we were going to hire, he said, listen, if we're talking about abilities, then obviously I only want to choose the person who's most able and capable to do this job. And if we're talking about sexual orientation, then you're not going to have a senior rabbi around you anymore. I can't work in a place that's going to make decisions based on that. And he was young. He was in his 40s. And he really was putting his job on the line. And they all followed in line. And we hired this rabbi. And she herself was going to get married. And she didn't understand how it was possible that she'd be getting married. But we ourselves didn't officiate at same sex unions. It wasn't legal nationally yet. But religiously, of course, it could be. So there was a gay and lesbian concerns committee, and we all gathered, and it was sort of an uncomfortable. I was only 6 months into my job, and we were all put on the line. Will you officiate a gay same-sex marriage? And listen, my mother at that point had come out as gay. My older sister had come out as gay. This was personal for me, but I also felt like there were a lot of really good people in the congregation who were just beginning to come to terms with something that was not mainstream yet. And I said, yes, I will, but after a 6-month period where we're going to actually sit down and study, and we're going to open up the books of tradition of all types, of the Torah and the Jewish law and lore, what's called Midrash parables. And then there has to be a difference between time to teach people and intolerance. If after 6 months, people are still acting with education and intolerance, we're going to have to move on and we're going to do these things. But given how quickly it came, I wanted to make sure the congregation had time to understand what was happening before it just happened. And got in the elevator that night to go upstairs to the lobby. I started to cry in the elevator because I thought I'd betrayed my mother and my sister. And I went down the street to the bar and ordered a scotch and called my mother and my sister. And I said, I betrayed you. And they listened carefully and they said, you didn't. You're doing what's good for the long run here. You're going to end up bringing more people along with you. And people still need time right now. And of course, justice delayed is, you know what I'm saying, is it?
Justice delayed is justice denied.
Correct. So that's what was sitting with me. And I'm proud to say that 6 months later, I was the first person ever to officiate at gay weddings at that synagogue. I proudly have officiated many in New Jersey. But what I learned politically was that we didn't just officiate at weddings. We started to hold gay and lesbian Sabbath dinners once a quarter, where even Orthodox Jews who had no place else to go would come to us. And the committee really wanted straight allies to come to the dinner. So I took it seriously and I came with others from the congregation. And someone leaned over to me and said, isn't it, cute or something like that? Isn't it just rich? He said, that all of you upstairs represent limousine liberals who vote for these rights, but don't come down and have dinner with people who are celebrating being gay. But and he said, I, a Republican, and if you look around, they vote differently than you do, but we're actually here. And you're not seeing us. You're not acknowledging us. We have the same values. We just get there differently politically. And I honestly didn't take it seriously until I came to New Jersey and was accused regularly of the same thing. And I realized that I was not being an honest broker with my conservative congregants. And they started to worry that I would not be present for them in the God forbid moment or in the celebratory moment because my politics were different than theirs were. And that really bothered me because imagine saying to a doctor that he wouldn't operate on someone or she wouldn't operate on someone killed in the field who was your enemy. Of course they do. And so I realized that I had to become a more honest broker spiritually and politically so that my Republican congregants knew that I cared about them as much as my Democratic ones. I never thought that was a possibility, but it definitely was.
Well, and I've seen the appreciation, respect, indeed the love that many of your congregants have for you and your openness to embrace others. As you said, Rodeph Sholom in New York was a liberal congregation, but Jeshurun maybe a little bit less so. What are the graces of the gifts of what we call liberal, and what are the challenges or weaknesses that you see?
It's very hard because I'm obviously in this moment being self-critical. I haven't stopped being a liberal. By the way, I'm now a political independent. A couple of reasons for that. One of it has to do with Israel, and I feel abandoned by the far left of the party, and I'm happy to talk openly about that. And the other reason is because I wanted my congregants to know that I was going to be an umpire who saw values as they came to me and not through a political lens. And so I haven't yet voted for a Republican nominee for president. It doesn't matter. Here I am being apologetic already. But I think that some of the liberal parts of our country have become intolerant of other points of view in ways that I did not experience as a kid. And I thought, the whole point of a liberal democracy was to enhance conversation, to deepen conversation. And I don't want to get into the whole problem with labels as, cancel culture has come to mean things that I don't want it to mean when I talk about it. But I have felt thrown out of certain circles for having certain points of view when I agree about everything else except for one or two issues. And it never used to be that way. So that I think is my critique of liberalism in America. And I think it needs to find its way to its roots, which is supposed to be a more open tent. We used to joke about Republicans having an open tent because they'd have a couple of token this, token that. But I sometimes worry that liberals are pushing people away as well.
Well, and my experience often is that liberals, and I certainly put myself firmly in that camp, want to get the argument right and spend a lot of time on getting the argument right, and then don't go downstairs for the meal.
That's so well said.
And I remember going to a gun show a bunch of years ago, being very much involved in gun violence prevention. And when I went to this gun show, I was hearing language and in from people that I didn't understand. These are all gun owners, and they're talking about ammunition coefficients, this, that, and the other. And I realized, oh my goodness, I don't know this language, but it's deeply American. It's part of the foundation of who we are. Guns have been part of us. I may not like that, but that's part of who we are. And I think the fear of gun owners is that we're going to take away not just their guns, but their culture. And I realized in that moment how arrogant and self-righteous and smug I can be. And that is, I think, the shadow side of being liberal.
Do you remember we were on Morning Joe together, you, myself, and Imam Sharif, the Friday after Newtown? So it was a week after the shooting in Connecticut, Sandy Hook, I'm talking about. I was anti-gun, and that day I became pro-gun safety. And the reason is this: Joe Scarborough said to us on national television that there's a difference between growing up in New York City, where a cop comes in 90 seconds, versus a farmer in Kansas who may have to wait a half hour and needs to protect his wife and kids. And I also was smug. I didn't believe there was another path. And so I used to be anti-Second Amendment. I'm not. I'm just pro. Remember the emblem that we had the kids from Newark draw? Support and protect our children. It shouldn't be that hard.
As you reflect back on your rabbinate and look forward, where do you find hope?
Well, I find enormous amounts of hope in conversations like this when there are people who are willing to probe and deepen themselves and then uncover what is natural, I think, to human beings, which is innate love and care for other people. And when that reservoir is opened, it feels like life is as good as it gets, even in the middle of things being lousy. And as I've gotten older, I reflected on all the things that I should have listened more carefully to when my father told them to me, which was to drive through Vermont. And he would say, "Look at the Green Mountains." And I would say, "Who cares?" And now I'm obsessed every spring with the trees still for years now, several years. The tree becomes this bud, and the bud becomes a flower, and the flower becomes a leaf. And just 2 months before that, they look like they're so barren that there's no way they could ever become life again. And I do believe that we are part of the natural order of life. And that if the tree can bud after a barren winter, then I believe we can. And I learned a new text this winter when I was in Israel. And the text says that not only did I say what I just said might be true, but the sap, the resin inside of the tree, is actually being produced when the tree is most barren, when it's most naked, when it's most afflicted by the wind and by the snow and by the rain. And just when you think not only can it never have life again, you think it's going to fall, it's in that moment that it's beginning to renew itself. And so I sort of think and hope and pray that in these times that feel for me that this is the worst of times that I've experienced, that right now we are producing the sap from within, the resin from within, that's going to help renew the world. So that's where it comes from.
I want to thank you for that image, for the power with which you speak, the commitments that you have, the integrity that I have always experienced with you and from you as you move through this very difficult time, not just Israel, Gaza, but in America as well. And the desire that you have and continue to demonstrate of being in relationship with these difficult issues and also with people who have positions and orientations that are different from yours. So I just really want to thank you for this time, Matthew. Can you tell this listening audience how they can be in touch with you? How can they follow you?
Yeah, that's very kind. And I'll just say, I'm sure your audience knows this. You make it very easy. You always have for me. So thank you for having me, and thank you for once again, I don't know how it happens. It almost feels magical that when you and I, or you, Dean, and I have a conversation, it doesn't do well on the superficial level. It only does well when we're deep, and we get there quickly. And it just doesn't work that way with everyone. So I so appreciate that.
Yeah.
I am on the regular platforms. I'm at Rabbi Matt on Twitter, and I have a website, Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz, and Facebook, and I actually do answer when people write to the website questions about things that I'm doing. It's easy to see, and times when I've been on television with you, and other times I've been alone. All of it's there, so it's all accessible, and I appreciate the world of sacred sport.
So I thank you for this time, and blessings to all. Thank you for listening to this episode of Reconciliation Roundtable. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and visit markbeckwith.net to stay up to date with new episodes, blog content, and other news. Please, if you could, rate and review this podcast on iTunes. It helps new listeners to find us.